Hey, how you doing? Jose Sierra, Two Countries, One Live, with my son Bo Sierra with me, filming more information for educating and uniting our Tejano brothers and sisters about the injustice that happened to us in 1941, the fraud that was perpetrated by the United States on Mexican-American families in Tejas. First of all, we're going to continue this campaign to show you what really happened and why it happened, and then what we believe we can do about it. But we're going to go through these episodes, new episodes, that you're going to hear more information about things you didn't know. The average Tejano doesn't know a lot of the information that affected their families and their lands. Okay, let's start with this bit of information. It happened in 1941 when they created the Treaty of 1941 that involved our ancestors' lands, the reparations that they made and gave the money to Mexico, which I have spoken many times about. What happened also in 1941 is another injustice that started in 1942 after the Japanese came and declared war on the United States. The United States was in a panic mode in 1942. It rounded up all the Japanese Americans because they looked different. Even though they were U.S. citizens, it didn't matter. The point is, they herded them off, put them in internment camps all over California and a few other states. The problem that you don't know about is that Texas was involved in a different way. Texas had 3 internment camps. Those 3 internment camps were Seagoville, Texas, Kennedy, Texas, and Crystal City, Texas. These 3 internment camps were different than the rest of the United States internment camps that held Japanese American citizens. Texas camps did not hold any U.S. citizens. They held Japanese, German, and Italian nationals. That is a major difference. Nationals means they weren't living in this country. They were kidnapped from Latin American countries. I think about 17 or 10 to 17 countries were involved at the time in 1942. And they actually based this kidnapping as legal by saying they were getting in preparation to be careful with the security of the United States through sabotage. These people had nothing to do with it. They were trade bait. That's all they were kidnapped for. Japanese nationals that lived in Peru and other South American countries, German nationals and Italian nationals that lived all through the South American countries, about 11 to 17 countries, I'm not exactly sure, but I know there's a lot of them. They were all kidnapped and brought to the United States and housed in Texas facilities. Those 3 facilities were Seagoville, Texas, Kennedy, Texas, and Crystal City, Texas. Let me tell you why this is important to Mexican nationals or Mexican Americans. Because at that time, this was the INS holding areas where they were holding Mexican nationals that were illegals or suspected of crossing the border without documents. Back in those days, they were the INS headquarters for Texas, and they captured Mexicans coming across the border and housed them in there. When the war started in 41 and 42, they cleaned them out. They actually got rid of all the Mexicans and brought in these people, about 5,000 to 7,000 people from these Latin American countries they were kidnapped from. Now, I say the word kidnap and it sounds outrageous, but it's exactly what happened. They actually went down there and grabbed all these people that were either living in those countries or doing business, or they were just being there, and they got caught down there in Latin American countries, and they were brought to the United States as trade bait. In 1942, the war was up and running, and we were already getting prisoners of war. The Germans and the Japanese and the Italians were capturing Americans. Well, the United States needed to have trade bait, and they would say, well, we're going to have to get Germans, Japanese, and Italians so we can trade to get our POWs back. Well, what they literally did is kidnapped innocent people that had nothing to do with the war. They were just living in Latin American countries, and they got those countries to cooperate under security measures, and they just brought them to the United States. Seagoville, Texas, and Crystal City, Texas, and also Kennedy, Texas, were important because these camps were holding non-citizens, and these non-citizens had no rights. I mean, they were even worse than the Japanese. They had no rights at all because they weren't citizens, but they were just trade bait, and they were used in that one aspect to get POWs from our soldiers back to the United States. The problem is, especially like Kennedy, Texas had convinced the INS to allow them to use those men. It was an all-men camp in Kennedy, Texas, the only one. The other one had women and children, and men, women, and children. And they used those men like slaves, like prisoners, and they would use them to do laborious tasks. The Kennedy, Texas ranch and all those used these people for free labor. I mean, nobody talks about this, and this history should be talked about. It's shameful for the people that did this. The reality of it is, because the United States was so paranoid and they couldn't decide on a correct policy, these people were used without any regard for their civil rights. Today, I doubt if this could happen because of the amount of civil rights exposure that people believe now that they can bring forth. In those days, they were non-citizens and nobody cared about them. The bottom line is they did whatever they wanted and they got away with it. What happened is this: in the internment camps in California and all the rest of the United States that held the Japanese American citizens, after 1945, they were released and allowed to go back to nothing. They lost their homes, they lost their businesses, they lost everything they had because they were put in jail illegally in the internment camps. And the problem was, in Texas, they weren't released because the international community of these Latin American countries did not want them back. They didn't want any of these people back. So the United States was kind of stuck after the war, and they actually hung around till 47, 48, 49, and weren't able to get rid of them because no countries wanted them back. So they dumped them, most of them, over in Asia, somewhere in Japan or whatever, to get rid of them. The problem is, years later, in 1972, Daniel Inouye was approached by a Japanese community, young people, and they said, what you did to our ancestors was wrong. And they said they wanted a reparations for what was done to the Japanese American citizens in California. What happens is they filed a bill that went through the Congress, and the bill actually passed because of Daniel Inouye's, he was a senator out of Hawaii. His insistence that they do the right thing for this huge wrong that was committed to Japanese American citizens. And what happened is the United States in 1988 gave an apology. Ronald Reagan gave an apology for what they did to those poor people in the Japanese internment camps in California that held U.S. citizens. The problem is they got $20,000 each, and they had lost probably a lot more than that each, individual cases, but that's all they were given. After that announcement in 1988, and the people, there was 110,000 people that were awarded $20,000 each. The problem is there was a little girl that was in Crystal City, Texas, who was not a U.S. citizen but was of Japanese American descent. And she now was an adult, and she felt that this was wrong, that the Japanese Americans got $20,000 each and an apology from Ronald Reagan, but they hadn't gotten nothing. They had got nothing. They were sent back to other countries, and their whole lives was kind of torn apart for no good reason. It was just because of they were paranoid about the war, and they were paranoid about people that looked different, and that's why these poor people were abused. What happened is she filed a lawsuit, and what she did was saying, hey, you gave them $20,000 each, and we were in internment camps too. And we think that we were wrong just like they were wrong. So she filed a lawsuit, and it went to the Supreme Court, and she won. the United States gave her a written apology instead of a verbal apology like the original people got from Reagan, and they got $5,000 each. This woman actually writes a book and tells a story about how she was kidnapped from a Latin American country as a national of another country and wound up in Crystal City, Texas. And she literally says in her book that she was kidnapped by the United States of America for reasons of bartering to give for POWs. And this injustice is an example of why we need to talk about this. Because in 1941, we were defrauded by the U.S. government. Our ancestors were defrauded. $193 million was given to Mexico on our behalf. We were U.S. citizens, and they ignored that and gave the money to Mexico because they knew Mexico was going to keep it, and they were trying to get Mexico to come on their side against the Nazis. The reality of it is this. If they did it to the Japanese American citizens, you don't think this could have been done against Mexican American citizens? That's what we're trying to tell you, that they were doing this all over the place, but nobody noticed. And I'm telling you now, as a Tejano, you need to notice. You need to understand that this was a wrong done to our people, and that we need to move on this, and we need to do the right things now, like the Japanese Americans did in 1972 with Daniel Inouye, and they got their reparations for what the wrong they went through for their ancestors. We need to do the same. And here's how you start. We're going to start a petition on our webpage. It's going to be out in a couple of weeks. And this petition is going to say that the Congress of the United States needs to have a full investigation on the 1941 convention between Mexico and the United States that involved Tejanos and reparations that was given to Mexico. We want the Congress to have an investigation so we can remove the statute of limitations. This is very important. You need to understand that as a people we need to unite behind this movement. So I'm going to work with some people to get our webpage with this petition online so you can register online to show the government that they need to right the wrong they did to us. Just like they did to the Japanese, they need to right the wrong they did to us. I want to thank you for the time that you gave me. And again, this is information about our cause. And this cause is justice, is to educate and unite all Tejanos at the same time to get justice for our people that was done in 1941 illegally. And I thank you for your time. Have a good day.